interpretation. A strong form of the principle would be 1. Under a just God, no innocent creature is ever wretched. A weaker form of the principle would be 2. Under a just God, no innocent creature ever suffers wretchedness which is not compensated by happiness at some later stage, for example, in an afterlife, obviously. A philosopher such as Leibniz, who seeks to emphasize God's concern for human welfare, may be expected to appeal to compensatory justice in an afterlife, and in fact this expectation is sometimes satisfied, as Don Rutherford has shown. Thus, Leibniz is prepared to defend too, or something like it. But in the Theodicy, he seeks to defend the stronger and philosophically more interesting form of the principle: under a just God, no innocent creature is ever wretched. Central to Leibniz's attempt to mount such defense is the concept of reflection. At first sight, Leibniz's appeal to the concept of reflection in order to explain why animals do not suffer misery is most unpromising. Moreover, it does not seem to offer an approach that would help with the case of small innocent children. It does not seem plausible to say that the pains of either animals or small children are mass or meager compared with those of adult human beings. Anyone who has worked in a slaughterhouse or even on a farm would surely be unimpressed by the claim that the pain of animals is lacking in intensity. Moreover, Leibniz sometimes defines reflection as attention to what is within us, and at first blush it seems simply false to say that small children do not attend to their pain. It is natural to suppose that the pain experienced by a small child with cancer or meningitis cannot fail to cross the threshold of consciousness and claim its attention. In order to see that he does in fact have a promising strategy, we need to realize that Leibniz, like some of his commentators, seems to be working with two distinctions when he expounds his doctrine of reflection. I'm pleased, of course, that we have in this room today the world expert on concepts like reflection, self-consciousness, and apperception in Leibniz, namely Mark Karlstad. First, there is the distinction between conscious and unconscious mental states. It is this distinction that Leibniz seems to have in mind when he says that the pain of animals is not as intense, vif, as that of adult human beings. This distinction, as we've seen, seems to offer no help with the problem of theodicy. But when Leibniz explains the doctrine of reflection, he often seems concerned with the quite different distinction between mental states that are the objects of self-consciousness and those that are not. As Leibniz says, reflection in this sense involves the ability to say I. This distinction, which has nothing to do with the level of intensity of the mental state, is much more promising for understanding why animals and small children can suffer pain without thereby also experiencing wretchedness or misery. For one thing, what is lacking in the case of small children and animals is the presence of fully self-conscious subjects that can ascribe mental states to themselves. It may still be objected that small children, at least at a certain age, can insist quite clamorously that they are in pain. Here it's perhaps relevant to cite the psycholinguistic fact that the mastery of personal pronouns is acquired rather late in a child's development. But more philosophically important is the fact that the child may not have a sense of a substantial self that persists through time and that may be the subject of chronic suffering. The child may have no sense of the pain as existing beyond the moment. Further, the child may lack certain interpretive concepts that are typically possessed by adults. The adult is able to reflect on his or her pain in the sense of thinking about its medical significance. Does this pain in my arm mean that I am suffering from heart disease? The anxiety brought on by such acts of interpretation is likely to be one of the main sources of what Leibniz calls the sadness that is required to give rise to genuine misery. It's natural to object, however, that invoking the concept of reflection in this way ignores Leibniz's familiar definition of reflection as attention to what is within us. But it's possible to reply to this objection without too much difficulty. Consider first the case of the small child who is not a fully self-conscious subject. In the new essays, Leibniz interestingly explains the concept of attention to what is in us by citing such properties of the mind as that it is a self-identical substance that endures through time. We acquire the concepts of identity, duration, and substance by reflecting on the mind's instantiation of these properties. The fact that the child does not reflect on the medical significance of his pain may also be seen as a failure of attention to what is in him or her. At first, this is a surprising claim, for it seems that attention need not involve an element of interpretation. For instance, if I ask you whether you are still bothered by the noise in the background, you may be able to answer without forming any interpretive hypothesis about its source. Moreover, typically in medical contexts at least, attention to pain does not so much involve an interpretive element as provide the data for an interpretation. The doctor may ask the patient to attend to his pain and rate it on a scale of 1 to 10. The doctor may then form a hypothesis about the nature and source of the pain. But at the risk of stretching the notion of attention too far, we may say that the child fails to attend to what is in him or her by virtue of failing to notice certain concepts that are latent in the mind. The child possesses innately and unconsciously the concept of meningitis, for instance, but fails to attend to the concept in the sense that he or she fails to activate a mental disposition. Leibniz then defends the Augustinian principle in Theodicy in the case of animals by appealing to the concept of reflection. I've suggested that Leibniz has the resources to extend this strategy to the case of small children. But how does Leibniz defend the Augustinian principle in the case of innocent, or perhaps better, virtuous adults? It may seem that Leibniz is debarred from adopting the same strategy here, for adults have a fully developed faculty of reflection. But it's characteristic of the faculty of reflection that it can be redirected from one object to another. It is the mark of the virtuous person that he redirects his attention away from the pain or suffering to something else that is in him. Reflection, remember, is attention to what is within us. Drawing on anthropological evidence, Leibniz offers a long and engaging, also rather horrifying, catalogue of people who have been able to achieve something like insensibility in the face of physical torments. Leibniz's examples range from Hurons who are roasted by their enemies to the wives of Indian gymnosophists who ask to be burned with the bodies of their husbands. Leibniz's goal here is not to hold up this varied group of people as models of virtue. At least one of them, a Spanish slave, is clearly a villainous character. Leibniz's goal, rather, is to show what it is psychologically possible for human beings to achieve, and to suggest that civilized Christians should draw inspiration from the feats of the savages, in quotes. Even in the midst of physical torments, we are capable of achieving a state not just of near insensibility with respect to the suffering, but also something approaching joy. There is no suggestion in Leibniz's catalogue of the feats of the savages that the techniques employed to achieve these states need be morally edifying. They may be morally neutral or even dubious. What Leibniz may have in mind may be close to the Victorian mother's famous advice to her daughter on her wedding night to think of England. Consider also the techniques that some of us employ when we are in the dentist's chair having our teeth drilled. We can turn our attention away from the pain to such things as the pattern in the curtains or the picture on the wall in front of us. Or we may redirect our attention by imagining some treat that we have promised ourselves once the ordeal is over. Like the Hurons and the Indian gymnosophists, the truly virtuous person avoids wretchedness in the face of physical torments. Here, the phrase truly virtuous person functions analogously to Spinoza's free man. But the truly virtuous person would seem to differ from the Hurons and the gymnosophists in two ways. First, the goal of the virtuous person, or the person who would become truly virtuous, is to achieve joy, not just insensibility to pain. Leibniz is explicit that it is joy, not mere patience, as the Stoics thought, that constitutes true morality, and that it must be founded on the perfection and beauty of things. Secondly, it would seem that the techniques employed to achieve such a state of joy must not be morally neutral or dubious. The truly virtuous person is the one who, as a result of education and long practice, acquires the habit of reflecting on the fact that he or she lives under a just God whose providence directs all things to a good end. The truly virtuous person's stock of beliefs regarding divine justice may include the thought that she will be compensated for her suffering in an afterlife, but it is the belief in the existence of God who dispenses compensatory justice, not the compensation itself, that seems to be at the heart of Leibniz's Theodicy here. I'm nearly finished. On the face of it, then, The virtuous person aims at joy in the midst of physical pain,